Hello, welcome to this Grasshopper and mostly Rhino tutorial on learning how to extract images and imagery in a more narrative sense from Rhino, usually used to explain your Grasshopper script. Uh, really quickly, I'm just going to cover what script we're looking at today. On the left in the Rhino viewport window, you'll see this mesh. This is something that came out of Revit. It's not a super easy to read or clean mesh. If we turn off mesh wires, it doesn't get much better, but you do start to see some of the contours and shapes, at least a little bit in rendered mode. But overall, it's very polygonal, very problematic. So the script we're going to be looking at, I'm going to be explaining with visual language, is a script that essentially re-evaluates this and kind of makes it look more natural, look a little bit more like how a topography normally does. This is for making a model, by the way. So some of what I'll be doing is in order to keep it as a solid to either test a 3D print or to run it on the CNC mill. So just looking over here, you'll see it's a very sequential script. There's not a lot of branching that happens here. What I am trying to explain through my um, various imagery is the basic components here, where we start with a mesh and then we take a grid of points, and we, in particular, a square grid, and we project them onto the mesh here. Then we create curves from those points and a surface from those curves. That's a bit cleaner. It's also easier to work with in Grasshopper. And then as we scroll in over here, most of what we're doing is creating essentially a solid out of various pieces. This is not probably the most efficient way to do this. It even has some vestigial pieces here. And finally, we take that and we close all of we create a contour set from it, which doesn't totally close. From there, we close the rest of our lines, and we create our extrusions to make a much more three-dimensional, more appealing type of topography for making a model. In this case, on the CNC mill. So that's the big overview. It probably sounded a little tiring for me to go and explain what these components are. I didn't even go that in depth. But if you're not familiar with looking at the language of Grasshopper and how things go from the left to the right, which many of your potential critics may not be, then this is a better way to explain how the work was done and how it can be done again. You can also take this as, if you're trying to convince somebody why you should use or spend time developing Grasshopper script to make something repeatable, this is also a way to do that, because you can tell them what your input is, what you have to do in order to, what parameters you have to input, and then how you can control it, and eventually what your result will be. Okay? So overall, the graphic we're looking for looks less like a series of wires moving sideways and more like a series of images. We will zoom in slightly to this. And similarly, we start with this mesh. We take a grid and project the points to follow the surface. We create curves and then a surface. In that order, we make it solid and use the contour tool to make more complete contours. And we eventually get our solids and our different ways of rendering and understanding them as more of a acceptable type of contour model versus this original mesh that we had on the left. You'll notice I didn't add the part of closing some curves. Just like when you're presenting, you do not have to explain all the very technical details. That's just something that you do to make it work. And it doesn't detract from the overall message of how you get from this into this. Okay? So we're going to move back to Rhino. First, I would recommend that if you're going to be doing this, to structure this similarly to how you would in Photoshop. And when I say that, I mean, if you do Photoshop well, you create layers and you label them. Some of you may not do that, but in this case, you can already see I've created these layers. If you start taking the actual physical objects out of your script and putting them into separate layers at key moments, you're going to have the ability to easily get this data into a visual form by exporting views or printing views. And then if you have a good viewport set up, you can do that repeatedly. So all of your individual images, as we'll see in this image again, are at the same orientation, same perspective, everything. It'll just make it much easier for your viewer to understand, be a little bit more seamless. So starting with this first set where, actually we'll start with the mesh. We can go ahead and take the mesh out. This is just on this first layer. In my case, I had the mesh wires on. It helps describe exactly what's happening since the shading in Rhino is not doing a great job at really conveying the difference here. You'll also notice that this seems to be a bit larger than what we did. If you are trying to explain your script simply, but the overall scale or largeness of your model doesn't easily make that available, such as showing all these points and that they actually follow the surface, you may want to zoom in on an area that emphasizes it a little more. An easy way to do this without just deleting everything is to create clipping planes. These are essentially things that hide everything behind them. I will first start by making a clipping plane. So we're really handling, I will start by making a vertical clipping plane. So we're really still working in the model in order to set up the narrative beforehand, before we start exporting. I'm going to take this clipping plane, I'm going to hold Alt while I use the gumball here to copy it, and I'm going to use Shift to make it actually 90 degrees. And so now I can kind of lock things in here. I don't actually want to see these clipping planes. I'm just going to hide them. Yes, you can hide them in your display port by clicking the clipping planes here. But as we start flipping through rendered versus shaded versus wireframe views, you'll have to change this every time. You can do it that way, absolutely. But I also know that I've hidden a clipping plane. It's much easier for me to think that, oh, I'm going to show it, instead of going through and clicking each of these boxes whenever I get frustrated trying to find where they're at. Anyway, we will zoom in to this a little bit. So from here, you want to look through like at your basic shape. You'll want to set your view to one of these, or at least get an idea for it. And then you're going to want to, and we will just create a new layer so I can turn off the mesh layer. So you can't turn off your active viewport. You'll want to see if that looks appropriate for each of these layers that you wish to take out. And this one shows pretty much the entirety of the idea that you want here. There's something that is a little broken in my script right now. I'm not going to worry about it. Finally, you're going to want to make decisions about what parts of your script you actually want to show. And once you find like a good view that kind of gives you everything here, I would start exporting out your data, or baking your data. So in order to bake things in Grasshopper, just take whatever object is you want, such as this is a square grid. I want to take that out because it shows the logic of where these points come from. I'm going to go to bake. If you've already created a layer, just click the layer to put it in there and then hit OK. I've already done this. But if you haven't, you can right click here in this panel and just make a new layer. So if I wanted to take these points out, I could right click and say bake and put them in that layer I just made. Remember that if you do not have things selected over here, you will not see the lines or anything as they show in the viewport. I would recommend baking out the things you want for export just so you have the control to be able to turn off and turn on the individual objects that you want, as opposed to trying to control everything through the Grasshopper viewport. So we're just going to say that we've created our layers and we've made everything baked out, because that's already been done to this model. So at this point in time, we're not taking anything out of Grasshopper. We can go ahead and close it. I'm going to just increase my Rhino window and then go back to viewing this. So say I want to keep this angle of this view. There's a handful of ways you can do this, or at least to get to the menu that allows you to do this. But what we're doing is we're creating a new named view. You'll notice down here that this already says 3/4 perspective export. Normally this will just say perspective. We're just going to create a whole brand new view based on where we're looking right now. One way to do this is if you go to the cogwheel in this panel over here, you can come down to named views. Make sure that guy is checked. The panel will look like a camera. You'll see that I already have one here. This one was set at the slightly different angle that you saw in that image before. This is a little bit more top heavy. If I want to create a new named view, so say you have nothing here, this floppy disk up here, you can click and it will do save as, and then you can name whatever this port is. If you name it something that already exists, it is going to save over it. So make sure you name it something new. In my case, it will be something new. Okay, so now that I have a named view, I can, if I rotate and, I get somewhat lost, or I accidentally brush it or zoom in and out on the scroll wheel, I can right click on or I can select it, and then I can come to this blue arrow that says restore and say to current viewport, and it will restore it back to where I was. You can also do to a floating viewport if you want one that just hovers over the rest of Rhino. Generally, I don't work that way. I get confused when there are windows just floating around everywhere. So similarly, if I go to this one and restore to current viewport, you'll notice that it is different here. It has also different properties set to the clipping planes right now. To current viewport. This is closer to what I was showing earlier. From here, most of what you're going to be controlling is going to be in your layers here. Generally, I will keep things just no materials so that they're easy to read and simple. And then I will change the layer colors. So things like my grid, I want to be red because I know that's not actual geometry. That, for me, is just visually an underlying structure. That whenever I start looking at lines, I'm doing this on a dark, or in the case of the example image, on a black background. I think the white looks good. This will depend on the graphic design of the type of board and presentation you're doing, so be sure to make those things be a little more continuous and relatable. Don't put something that's very synth-wavy here and then very natural looking into your actual renders on your board. And then so on. So some of these are going to exist because I want black line weight and I want the gray surface. Some of them are going to be because I just want the white showing up on the background because it's more of a line and less of a surface, etc. Once you do that, it'll depend a lot on how you want to actually change that. So this surface here, it's a little hard to tell that it comes directly off of the slices from here. I don't think the white really works well. So I'm actually going to turn on the ISO curves. It will also show you that that has a direct relationship as part of that surface. So go ahead and do that. Once you've figured out the individual pieces that you want to export out, your next goal comes from, in my case, the view capture tools. Those can also be found in various places. One is the arrow here, and then capture. Then there's to clipboard and to file. Generally, I do to file, and I put it in its own folder so that it's easy for me to drop into Affinity Publisher or InDesign or Photoshop or any of those programs that you would be using to compose your boards. But you can do clipboard if you're real confident in your Control-C, Control-V skills. You can also just type in capture. We'll come up with view capture and screen capture. View capture to clipboard and to file. Just as long as it is a command, it'll show up here. The other way you can do this is through the print dialog. I will go over that just a second after we do this view capture. So say I want to keep this image. I'm going to do view capture to file. And you'll see you get a kind of a preview here. It's not a fantastic preview. The things to know here is that you can add a transparent background if you're not concerned about the background or if you're trying to go over a different color field. Whether or not you have the grid, world axis, C-plane axis, I usually just have them turned off by default. And then whether or not you want it to be the same resolution as your viewport. In our case, our viewport is 1581 by 790. It's just the size of this box on my screen. And then you can scale that. Right now I have this set to 3. That's pretty big. These would be not small files. If you do 2, it'll just be double. So 1581 times 2 is 3162. If you do 0.5, it will be half. And it'll round here and there. You can also display this in inches. If you have your DPI setting here, that is also totally fine. It's whatever you're more comfortable with. If you're working more in a DPI workflow and you need it to match your boards and you know exactly how big that thing is going to be, or at least how big that thing is going to be if you're going to scale it down, maybe this works better for you. But I generally just stay in pixels. I know most of these things more natively this way. So go ahead and hit OK, and it will take you somewhere to save things. Make a folder is my recommendation. Don't just save them randomly to your desktop or into your pictures folder. It's really that easy. That is exactly just by changing these items and placing them on a board. In my case, in Affinity Publisher, you can make a pretty easy and readable and graphically good looking, or at least professional board. From there, you add text. You can do certain things, like this image was scaled to these images, and then I did a half. They're all in addition since they're all in black. And then I did a half or a 30% tone here in order to make it read differently from this, but show that these two pieces are using this as that intermediary area for the data. Work on the narrative itself more than on just exporting a ton of graphics. If you know what you want to say before you say it, it's easier to get that material. Sketch it out. Do a thumbnail sketch. All the same things we say about doing boards and graphic design, just on their own. You'll note that whenever you take things out with this view capture, it's really going to be taking out raster images. Most of the time, that is totally fine. However, if you need to edit or change some of these things like line color and stuff, and you want to be able to do it in another program without having to jump back into Rhino in order to get these, you can use the print command. That's going to be under File and Print. It's also Control P. You can also type in print to the command line. Just go to print. It depends on what you write with normally. Rhino PDF is totally fine. It's going to have a variety of sizes that you can print to if you want to. You can use this as just a baseline to figure out your overall size, or you can kind of ignore it if you're just going to take the vectors out. In our case, we're looking at that surface. You'll notice it's not gray because I have vector output selected. This will come through as actual line work in Illustrator. You'll want to still try to organize this by layer and make sure that it's easy to select so you don't have to select each individual curve in Illustrator. That's very tedious. But this type of workflow is what was used in a lot of the images that you see for professional publication. I believe Manual of Section by Lewis or Marky Lewis, which is a fantastic book. I highly recommend you look at it in order to like improve your graphical stylings and illegibility for things like sections. But in that book, they used a workflow from Rhino into Illustrator where they could really manually control those line weights. They could really evaluate them based on each drawing itself. They got the lines out that they needed to, and then they were able to focus on it as a graphical piece as opposed to just an architectural piece. There's a handful of other options here, like changing your print color, display color in black and white. This is going to be more similar to when you're exporting DWGs from AutoCAD. You'll set your line types and line weights usually by layer. View output and scale is here. You don't really have to worry about scale if you're doing perspectives, but if you're doing plans and you're trying to show a sequential thing, so say we go from the top, which is a very boring drawing right now, you'll see that the scale section is here. All of your different settings for sizes are located down here. Quarter, 16th inch, whatever you need. You can also custom do something here where you're saying 1 inch here is 1 inch in the model, or go by feet or yard. Experiment with those. Find the one setting for your project that's going to work for you. Use that one. Try not to change too much of this because you'll have a lot more work scaling things later on. Other things like margins and position, it's the same as in Word or Excel or any other thing you've ever printed in. Line types and line widths, if you're editing this in Illustrator, you're probably going to do some of this in Illustrator, but you can change something here on the fly if you are just trying to go quickly, or if you want to differentiate, or exactly kind of how you're going to be setting this up already. And then visibility here is going to have some other things that we saw in that display port that you can turn on and off here if you need to. This tool here is going to be for doing more professional, larger, and generally finalized work. I wouldn't expect somebody who's just kind of iterating on something to use the print dialog that much. But if you find this more comforting and more structured, go ahead and use it. If not, then view capture is totally fine as long as you're communicating well. That's the important part. So that should be it. This is somewhat of a long video, but I hope that helps you understand ways you can take imagery out, ways to think about presenting your work, and ways that you can really get your idea across in a quick, easy, and efficient way. Thank you.